Gary Fettke. Gary's an orthopaedic surgeon from Launceston, has been very active in the last year or two, has a website called nofructose.com, and he's been active on a number of fronts, as you will hear. Thanks.
Afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Still awake after lunch? How many had carbohydrate and is now feeling the lag? I'm an orthopaedic surgeon. I've been known for being a little bit controversial over time. Don't have a problem with that. I've got a very tolerant wife. 20 years ago, I refused to operate on smokers because they had a higher risk of complications. And I used to give a paper called "Where there's smoke, there's fire." There was enough literature around at that point in time to tell me that it was a bad idea. I'm here to make amends today. I've refused to take children's plasters off unless they bring me a chocolate cake. Done that for a long, long time. Realised I made a few flaws. Like Grant Schofield, I actually operate in Vanuatu. Well, he doesn't operate over there, he does sort of work in the South Pacific. I operate in Vanuatu every year, and they've got a health crisis, which is right now, and it's related to their diet. It's related to the introduction of the Western diet. It's a little bit about my professional side, but we'll talk about me now because it's a me society. I was raised on sugar, margarine and refined carbohydrates. As it turned out, I ended up being 12 stone at the age of 12. I was a fat kid. I'm lighter now than I was at the age of 12. I was pimply. I was bullied. At the age of 38, which is 13 years ago now, I ended up with a brain tumour. Base of my skull, ended up in intensive care, had neurosurgery, and I came back from that to practice medicine and orthopaedics again. I had to learn to walk again. They sent me to Tasmania, and that's why I'm still practicing there. How did I get into this trouble? I've had chemotherapy and radiotherapy, and I can tell that chemotherapy does actually make me do that. It got me to thinking. As I thought about it, I actually believe that the combination of sugar, polyunsaturated oils and refined carbohydrates are toxic. I know David talks about the sugar and the polyunsaturated oils. Gary Taubes is about refined carbohydrates. Robert Lustig is about fructose. I think it's the combination, and I think the more we look into it, the more I think it's the problem. I actually think that the food pyramid is causing our disease. Denise Minger, at the end of this year, is bringing out a book. She's a blogger out of the United States. It's called Death by Food Pyramid. I can't wait to get hold of it. I've got it on order. I think it'll be an interesting read. I think the food pyramid has created our Western disease. Now I look at my own nutrition education as a doctor. I can't seem to remember it. If it was there, I didn't pay attention. I don't think it's there for the medical students. When I try and give this talk to medical students, I actually got, not officially banned, but I was requested not to give it again. The medical students, you'd be glad to hear, in Tasmania have requested I give lectures to them on the side, specifically about that. What lectures I did get, I seem to remember about vitamin D deficiencies, vitamin C deficiencies, but I received nothing about what happens if you have an excess. So what education do we get now as doctors? Well, we don't actually get a lot. And what's in time constraints, it's not actually there. And what education we do get tends to come from pharmaceutical companies. There's not a lot of time in the day, we're all busy people, not just doctors. And as doctors, we're taught generally to compartmentalise problems. So if you come along with a condition, I listen to your symptoms, I do the investigations, and I try and put you into a box. That's the way medical education, or that's the way doctors think. Not many people think outside the box. So one of the problems in medicine at the moment is it's very reactive. You go along, you've got your medical problems, you've got diabetes, you've got heart disease, and we look at all the ways you can medicate. We look at ways you can try and reduce risk factors, but very rarely we actually go back to the start of the problem. What was the start of the problem? And to me, if we're going to look at the start of the problem, let's go back in history. We've evolved over time. We've evolved from hunter-gatherers. I think you know where we are at the moment, and I'm pretty certain I know where we're heading. I'd be glad to hear someone actually complain to me on my Facebook page, Gary Fettke, no fructose. I'm making no money out of this, by the way, people. That I was, upsetting pigs, and could I change my Facebook profile picture? I'm not kidding. So let's look at history. We can argue how long we've been hunter-gatherers, but I reckon some 2.5 million years we've been evolving. And the food sources for hunter-gatherers were seasonal fruit. Oops, sorry, I'll come back. As hunter-gatherers, our food sources were local, seasonal and natural. Exactly what they were: seasonal fruit, seasonal honey. Remember, bees, everyone talks to me about honey's natural. What a load of crap. Excuse me, I swore. Bees make honey when the flowers are in season. They go and put it in a beehive, in wax, store it up somewhere nice and high, and then they guard it. It's not meant to be in our pantry. We used to eat animals if we could catch them. And if you actually look at lions eating, the very first thing they eat on a carcass is the fat. Then they eat the liver, the spleen, and the last thing they eat is they chew on the meat. So we're designed to go and eat that fat. We eat insects where we can get hold of it. We've been designed to have breast milk forever, rich in galactose, which is converted to lactose. And I know a lot of people are lactose intolerant. It's really quite interesting. We're meant to have lactose, and we can tolerate it for a long period of time. And if you actually withdraw that out of your diet, which is what we tend to do often as in teenage fads and in young adults, we lose our ability to have the amount of lactase and then metabolise lactose. So I think we're a lot to blame ourselves for our lactose intolerance, because it's in fact that we've in fact stopped producing lactase ourselves. We've been having root vegetables. I have a bowl of nuts on my bench at home, which is still in their shells. Have any of you tried to break them open with your bare hands? So when we grab a handful of cashew nuts out of the pantry, or a handful of peanuts, and we scoff them down, what I want you to do is actually think about how much labour it's involved to in fact do that individually, nut by nut. Be a hunter-gatherer. We've been collecting eggs for a long period of time, knocking them off from bird life. At 10,000 years we started to domesticate animals, we started becoming farmers, and we used to produce fibreful grains. In the industrial age over the last couple of hundred years we started to mechanise things, we became a lot more efficient. And in the modern age it's all about convenience. We all love shopping for cheap food which is readily available, sits in our pantry forever, doesn't go mouldy. We love mass production, we love cutting costs, and the big corporations love giving us profit, or go for profit. So in the most modern era, we're talking back into the 60s and 70s, there was a great fat versus sugar debate, Ansel Keys versus John Yudkin. We heard a little bit about that earlier today, and I'll summarise it in my terms. Ansel Keys came up with his 7-country study, arguably cherry-picked data from the 22 countries data. It all suited the food industry because that meant that high-fat food was bad for you, low-fat food was good for you. Low-fat food tastes like cardboard, we had to add some sugar to it, need to sweeten it. Nixon needed to stimulate the agricultural community, and out came the whole subsidies for the corn industry. High fructose corn syrup was born. Just per chance, high fructose corn syrup was in fact invented by the Japanese. Japanese then sold that technology to the United States. Just begs into question who's actually won the war. John Yudkin tried to debate this. He's a professor of nutrition out of Great Britain, released the book Pure, White and Deadly. And he said if you feed rats fat, they don't get fat. If you feed rats sugar, you get the full metabolic syndrome. And in the fat versus sugar debate, Ansel Keys won hands down. The US food and agriculture industry got off to a good start. But look who's smiling more as time goes on. John Yudkin wins. It's very simply, sucrose or sugar is a molecule which is half glucose and half fructose. Glucose and fructose look very, very similar. Both 6 carbon atoms. And we know an enormous amount about glucose metabolism. I've got textbooks of biochemistry back 30 years. It tells us everything about glucose. It's got one page on fructose. In 2010, Luc Tappy, a Swiss physiologist, published a review article on the physiology of fructose metabolism, the first definitive article telling us what happens to fructose when you take it in. So here we are, we've been having natural sugars forever, we've been ploughing it into our system, we know everything about glucose, and here in 2010, less than 4 years ago, we finally worked out how on earth, what we actually do with fructose and what happens after it. You heard about the Krebs cycle earlier today, after you give off a phosphate molecule. And I find this a fascinating starting point if you're actually interested in physiology without going into too much detail. When asked to look at the science and nutrition at the moment, nutrition guidelines have been around for hundreds of years. They're there to try and tell us what to eat and in what quantities. Back in 1862, William Harvey described the Banting diet, and I've changed it a little bit into modern language. Sweet and starchy diets were used to fatten animals. We still do that today with grains. And those people who reduced their sweet and starchy diets with effortless success, with no more than a few ounces of fruit or stale toast per day, did very well and lost weight. The father of modern medicine, William Osler, in 1901 stated obese women should avoid taking up too much food, and particularly the starches and sugars. We're not doing anything smart here today. All we're doing is looking at history. I got a hold of this book recently. There are only 2 copies in the world. The Practice of Endocrinology by Raymond Green. The obesity treatment, 1948, was foods to be avoided: bread, cereals, potatoes, foods containing sugar or anything sweet. You can eat as much as you like of the following foods: meat, fish, birds, green vegetables, eggs, cheese, and fruit, except bananas and grapes. There's no rocket science in this. Where did we get it wrong? Welcome to the 1950s. We started looking at convenience food. Remember that money makes the world go round. Big industry started introducing into our food cycle sugar, taking fibre out of our food, and introduced polyunsaturated oils to reduce the cost of production and ultimately look at profit. We know that sugar is a great preservative. You know that because if I give you a piece of grain bread or a loaf of grain bread, it goes mouldy in your pantry fairly quickly. You add a bit of sugar and take the fibre out of it, and white bread will last a bit longer. Then you make raisin bread, it's still fresh a couple of weeks down the track. And that fruit cake, which is served up on your wedding day, you can still have at the time of the birth of your child because it's still there as a preservative. It's full of sugar. The moment you put fibre in food, it goes mouldy. So let's take the fibre out of it. Who's ever seen white flour go mouldy in your pantry? I'm not telling anything you haven't noticed. And in summary, polyunsaturated fats, this is one of the very few times in my life, David, that you've actually given more science about polyunsaturated oils than I'm going to do. I'm going to dumb it down. Polyunsaturated oils have got lots of double bonds in them. That gives them the flexibility. Each one of those points is a point of weakness. It's a point where oxidation occurred. Oxidation is rust. Rust is inflammation. So we've got to thank our food industry for giving us manufactured natural food. I've upset a few farming colleagues. I've got some apple farmers that used to come to me in Tasmania. And I did actually, one of them used to bring along 2 bags of apples each year at harvest time, one untreated, one fresh. After 2 to 3 days, the fresh ones definitely started to taste a bit floury. The other ones kept that crispness. And he did tell me about all the processes that went through into making our current natural food. And I cop a bit of flack when I talk about people, you shouldn't be eating too much fruit. But beyond, I talk about having one piece of local seasonal fruit per day if you're going to do it. And for Tasmania, a lot of the time that's a lemon. It's certainly not natural to have a banana in Tasmania at any time. It's certainly not natural to have an apple in the middle of winter. So we're to thank the food pyramids. Food pyramids started in 1970 in Sweden. If you look into the food pyramid, it was the one that we're familiar with, 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice and pasta was released in 1992. It actually started being worked on in 1980. And if you look into the history of it, Louise Light, who was one of the nutritionists initially involved in it, their recommendation was 3 to 4 servings of that bottom food group maximum. The food lobbyists got on board and ultimately it was released with 6 to 11 servings. Just culpable. Now we were all raised to worship the food pyramid. Our teachers were taught it at school, it was ingrained in our brains, the health authorities recommended it, and the medical profession kept doing it. However, when you look at the science of it, I actually think the science was made to fit the puzzle rather than looking at it in a different way. When you start looking at the science over the last 40 or 50 years, what on earth have we been measuring? We measure so many variables, it's impossible to interpret it. We look at population studies, we look at weights of people, we look at metabolism, we look at varying degrees of activity. These are all major variables. Who's ever tried to work out whether or not you're a little bit hungry, a moderate bit hungry, or a lot hungry? And then apply that to a scientific study. So nutritional science is complex. It's human studies, animal studies, and the whole lot's actually coloured, I think, by funding, it was alluded to before. Nobody's got any money for this unless you're in the food or the pharmaceutical industry. And that's what's spat out at the bottom. It all comes down to dollars. Any of you have tried doing some nutritional science research, including myself, it's nearly impossible. I actually can't do a study in northern Tasmania at the moment because anybody who hears my name associated with it knows that I'm anti-sugar. So if you look at human observational studies, they tend to be historical in nature. Who can remember what they had for breakfast yesterday? Okay, who can? All right. Did you have, if you had milk, did you have 200 mils of milk or 250 mils of milk? Already, we've got a 25% error in your energy intake. Did you have 5 cashew nuts or did you have 10 cashew nuts? 100% error in energy intake. And if you did actually record it, then you're completely and utterly obsessive compulsive and I don't trust you anyway. So it all comes down to estimates. Historical data is by estimates. And there was a recent PLOS article which reviewed the energy intakes of people of US nutritional studies for the last 40 years. Boring as anything, but when you read into it, of the articles, essentially reported intakes of food were unsustainable for 50% of the people who reported them. So essentially, all nutritional data out of the United States in the last 40 years is wrong. So we can immediately wipe nutritional data studies out of the United States for 40 years. Oops, there goes a fair amount of my talk. There are compounding factors of environment, socio-economic. As I say, I operate in Vanuatu. It's a completely different environment for food and it's related to the availability as distinct from Australia. If you want to do prospective studies, they're incredibly expensive. They involve a lot of time and you've got to get ethics approval, and David alluded to that just before. You can't actually do the studies now if you really want to go at it because the data is flawed, and if you look back, you can't actually poison the next group of individuals. The other thing about, and I know that Coca-Cola have a sponsored talk in Sydney next Monday, saying that sugar, I think the gist of the talk is going to be that sugar's fine. Now, without bagging out one of the speakers before he even speaks, which is very rude of me, if you look at an isolated food substance, which is being looked at in those talks, of fructose, you never actually take that in just as fructose. So the data's flawed right from the word go. Who here has ever just had one substance? Even if you have sugar, it's half glucose, half fructose. We always take our food in combinations, meat, vegetables. So therefore measuring food intake becomes complex and it's got interactions with your fluid intake as well. So what are the other problems with human studies? I think there's a whole degree of variables. Our metabolism changes by age. Our metabolism and our energy requirements change with activity. We've got different basal metabolic rates. We've heard about stress. Stress plays a big role, which is yet to be determined exactly how much, but it's definitely there as a major issue with obesity. The amount of energy we take up is definitely dependent on how much we sleep. I didn't get any sleep Thursday night, but I was in the operating theatre. I was hungry by the following morning. We know that smoking is an appetite suppressant. What environment you're in changes your energy and basal metabolic requirements. And when you're looking at nutritional studies, compliance is a major issue. The vast majority of us do not adhere to everything we've been told. How many people here who can go to the doctor and do exactly as they're told? Right, thank you. Need about a certain amount of intelligence to do all these studies and actually be compliant and actually follow them. And I alluded to the problems of food estimates. If you look at human nutritional studies which are intervening, it's actually you change something. They're very, very restrictive. Let's change the way you eat, change your diet to just this or just that. Very hard to draw conclusions from that. And if you then look at the environment, most of those studies are actually done in hospitals or in prison populations, far from anything normal. Laboratory studies I quite like. They've got less variables, more controlled environments, and we use rat experiments a fair amount to try and draw conclusions. The thing about rats is they've got a similar metabolism to humans, apart from one thing, which again I think the sugar log are going to throw up here, is that one of the things they talk about with sugar, with rat experiments, is that the doses used in rats of sugar-laden foods are dramatically higher than that consumed by humans. And the simple reason for that is rats have an enzyme in them called uricase. You've heard of uric acid, it's associated with gout. It is a byproduct of fructose metabolism. And rats have evolved over the millennia to actually have a thing called uricase, which means they can clear uric acid out of their system a lot quicker and therefore be tolerant of environmental change. So therefore, by definition, rats have a very similar metabolism to humans apart from uricase. So bear that in mind, that it's okay to use rats to gain the information. I alluded to research funding. The vast majority of studies are industry-based, whether or not it's the food industry or the pharmaceutical industry. So at the end of looking at nutritional science, I am confused. I try and draw conclusions, but I've got to admit, I don't have it worked out. I haven't spent as much as some people looking at all this, but I've spent a fair amount of time. So my take on all of this is my interpretation of the information that I've gleaned over time. Here it is. Modern disease is related to inflammation. You've heard that a bit today. Our bodies are inflamed. And which bit's inflamed? I think it's arterial inflammation, arterial wall inflammation. You get narrowing of the arteries, and that inflammation occurs there. I think the combination of sugar, polyunsaturated oils and refined carbohydrates creates that inflammation. I'm going to briefly go through this. I'm an orthopaedic surgeon. You know how you hide money from an orthopaedic surgeon? You put it in a book, right? Because we don't read. But we like pictures. Here are some pictures. Fructose essentially is converted into the bad LDL. You've got a choice of filling up those low-density lipoproteins, those LDLs, but you've got to fill them up with some form of fat. In the modern era, we've filled up that fat with polyunsaturated fat, as distinct from saturated fat before. That saturated fat that polyunsaturated fat I know is prone to oxidation and rust, and that creates inflammation. So we've created this perfect storm in our blood vessel walls. We've given ourselves a diet high in fructose, which gives us a massive LDL load. We've then decided to fill up those LDLs with a rusty, inflamed material, and that creates inflammation in every blood vessel, in every organ of the body, which weakens every organ of the body, which gives us a susceptibility to all those other factors, whether or not it's genetic, environmental, chemical, planetary alignment, mobile phones, whatever. We then add into the equation an insulin response, which we know insulin is a propagator of disease. And we end up with this model here. It's a very nice picture. And I've just received this from Joan Gill from Barcelona. It's the original pictures, and this is from the origin of atherosclerosis. This is a picture of the blood vessel wall. Circulating around the system are the LDLs. And we don't have the pointers at work when I come up to here. These are the LDLs. They're what I call the Goldilocks molecule, or the Goldilocks LDL. They're just the right size to get into our blood vessel wall. Not too big, not too small. All the other lipoproteins, all the other lipids, they slide on by, or the HDLs go in and out. But the LDLs are the Goldilocks. They sit in here, in the subintimal layer. They get inflamed because they're full of those rotten polyunsaturated oils. And that process gives us inflammation. Here it is very quickly. Sugar is converted to LDLs. Those LDLs become oxidised and inflamed. You see that graph down the bottom there, bottom left, from Stefan Guyanet. Essentially, that's the amount of polyunsaturated fat in our fat. David pointed out the amount of polyunsaturated fat in our food consumption, but the graph on the bottom is the amount of fat that is in fact polyunsaturated fat, and that's a 300% increase in the last 50 years. That's a 300% increase in the amount of pro-inflammatory fat in our fat. Combinations, inflammation. So therefore, in summary, sugar, polyunsaturated oils and refined carbohydrates gives us inflammation in every blood vessel wall. I think it's time to start putting out the inflammation, not treating the final product. I think we can reverse modern disease by going back to the start and stop looking at the finish line. I do think we need to go back in time. You are what you eat, so don't be fast, cheap, easy or fake. I'd like to quote Mark Twain: "Be careful about reading health books. You may just very well die of a misprint." I want to thank you all very much. Thank you for letting me chew the fat with you this afternoon. You're welcome to join me as I politically take on the government, the Heart Foundation, the hospital administration, the dietitians, the ladies auxiliary who hate my guts because I keep saying they've got to take sugar and all that rotten sugary food out of the kiosk.